In this video, we're going to get started with the saved game feature. This is going to allow us to have 5 saved games. It's going to give the player the option to click New Game, which will load a new game, or the option to load the actual one of the 5 saved games that it has in currently in the config file. This uses config files for the saved games feature, which has its negatives and its positives. The positives is a lot easier than probably other options than making a saved game. The negative is that it's very easily modifiable. So if the player were to modify some of the stats in this, he could just set whatever score he wanted, things like that. Now, because this is a puzzle game, honestly, if a person decided to cheat or change how many points he scored, it really makes no difference to me because it's a single player game. Now, if you're making a multiplayer game and you wanted to use something like this, you may want to create some sort of encryption code which would encrypt what the actual result is, and then have another piece of code that that decrypts it so that you can read what the actual answer was from the config file, so that makes it harder for the player to manipulate the current information. Okay, so to get started, what we need to do is inside PuzzGame, we start off by removing the config from this integer player points. And the reason for that is because we no longer need to use it as a config. We'll be using our saved game info class to hold our player points now. But we will be using the player points though during the game anyway, so you don't need to delete it delete it, just delete the config part of it. Then inside of Puzz save game info, we are going to create it extends from object and it's config saved game, so it's going to create a or an INI file called UDK saved games, and it's a per object config, which means that it's going to create its own instance of this class inside of a config file for every instance that exists. So if there's 5 saved games, you'll notice that there'll be 5 of these throughout the config file. Also, we have inside of here we have 4 variables. They all config because we want to save them all. We have an ID num, a current map level num, player points, and player lives. And if you might have more things to add, go for it if you do. But for right now, this is all that's required for the game that we're making. Okay, so we're going to go inside of PuzzGFX main menu movie, and down at the bottom, inside of our default properties, we want to set the movie info to Puzz main menu 2 and .puzz main menu 2 because we are going to use a different movie this time because it has more functionality. And then we're going to scroll up to the top here, and we have 5 variables that we're creating. We have a constant variable called max saved games, and we're going to set that equal to 5. Now this is not the same as a normal constant that we've been doing before, where we do variable, constant, integer, or whatever. This is a special type of constant that allows you to set it at the top when the variables get created, and then that means you can also use it with your variables, which we do here. Also, notice that I don't tell what type of constant this is. I don't say it's an integer because Unrealscript will automatically set this to the type that we're setting the value of. So, for instance, we set the 5, so it's going to make it an integer. If we set it to a string, it would be then a string, and so on and so forth. So max save games, we're going to have 5 save games. So we have variable GFX object, save game screen, root screen. We have a button array, we have a button text field array, and we have load menu initialized for a boolean to make sure we only initialize the menu one time. We don't need to constantly in multiple times load the menu, because once we load the menu once and we tell it what the buttons each have, there's no reason to change that or to add it again. Okay, so inside of function initialize, we set root screen equals get variable object underscore root. This was a lot like what we did with the HUD. And then we have save game screen, which is equal to root screen dot get object save game menu. This is another way you can set objects by using get object. So I just wanted to show you there's multiple ways, and plus we'll be using this get object option, this function, further down here to grab our buttons. Then we go down to our on new game button pressed. And in this function, when the player clicks on the new game button, we're not just going to load some map right away. We're going to set new game to true, and we're going to load the start map. Now, we'll get to what set new game is in a second, but for right now, we're just gonna go with the flow here and say, okay, he's just starting a new game, and then load start map. We're going to load this first map in an obviously new game, which would be level 1. And we do that basically a lot like our advanced level. We have to grab world info first though, because world info does not exist inside of our GFX classes. So in order to do that, we grab it from a static function called getWorldInfo. And then we set load map to equal none. We set the PuzMap info to the default value of PuzMap info in the Puz game, and then we just do a for loop where we find where level 1 is, and we set the load map to that, and then we open that map if it exists. Now, you might say, why do we do this? Well, because your array that you set inside of your map info might not have array 0 as level 1. So you want to find level 1 because you might have, you might change it and set and move stuff around, and rather than constantly have to change your whole set of arrays, this allows you to not have to change your whole set. It allows you to just, add it where you want and make changes like that. Okay. So now that we have load start map, which gets called from there, so if the player clicks new game button, it basically starts the level 1. We're going to go down here to on load game button press. So when the main menu starts up and he wants to load a save game, he clicks the load game button. And when he does that, we are going to grab world info like we did before. We're going to say if B load menu initialized is false, which it should be if it's the first time the main menu is being used. And then we're going to do a for loop where I equals 0. And we're going to go through this loop 5 times because we have 5 saved games. During that 5 times, we're going to set buttons I to equal save game button I plus 1. The reason for this is because every button inside of the Flash movie that we created, we called it save game button, and then we added 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 on it. So that's pretty much the purpose of this, is to grab that name of the button. And then we have save game button I, so we're going to grab the first button, so it would be array 0, save game screen dot get object, and we're going to pass in the array 0 buttons, which would be save game button, 0, or in this case 1, because we add 1 to it. And we're going to make that of course of class GFX object is the type of get object we're looking for. Okay, so now that we have, so that's what this is going to do then, is it's going to find that button called save game button 1, and then it's going to also find the text field of save game button 1. It's going to set it to the button text field as well, so the arrays will match. And we do that by finding the name of the text field, which is called save game text. In this case, we don't have to create an array because every button has the exact same text field name called save game text. You can't do that with the buttons because you don't want to have one button count for the rest of them. But for the text field, you can do that because when a movie clips inside of a movie clip, it's different than, it's a completely different situation. Okay, so next we have if puz game worldinfo.game that save games I is not equal to none. So if there is an actual saved game, then we're going to set text to saved game and then the number. So it'll be save game 1, save game 2, save game 3, up through 5. And then we're going to set bload menu initiated to true, which basically stops us from doing this again. If the player were to click load game constantly, load it in, load it out, it would only do this one time because we only have to do it one time. Okay, so now that we have on load game button pressed, you may be saying, okay, well, what about clicking on the save game? Well, that is actually going to be initialized through ActionScript through the external interface. So we don't actually have the code for that because it's Flash code or scaleform code. But what I will say is that the function calls on this function. So it would be like external interface, and then it calls on the function name called set save game choice. So inside of here, it's going to pass in a parameter. So if the person clicks button 1, it's actually going to pass in the number 1. If he clicks button 2, it's going to pass in button 2 or the number 2. And that's going to tell us what option he chose. We're going to set that save game choice to equal param1 minus 1. So because we wanted to make it work for the array. So if he presses button 1, it passes in 1. We subtract 1 from it, makes it 0. So that means he chose the first button, which is the array 0 save game option. Then we're going to make sure that that save game option actually exists. And if it does, we're going to set save game to it. If it doesn't, nothing's going to happen. He's going to click the button. It's not going to do anything. Okay, so now that we have some functions to look at instead of our Puz game, let's head over there and get this fully involved. Now, this is actually part 1 and part 2 together. So you're going to see a finished result. So you're going to mostly see part 2 code, but there's a lot of part 1 code that's still around. there's a lot that's changed as well. For instance, in the beginning in post login, we have check new game. Well, we're going to change that to setup game in this case, and we're going to go from there. Inside of our puz game, we have multiple variables we've created as well. We have a constant called max save games, which is a lot like the main menu one. We have a variable class called puz saved game info, which is called puz saved game info class. We have a variable puz saved game info instance, which is for to hold our 5 saved games, and we have a version of just one by itself, which is actually going to hold one of those 5 games, save games, for us to use constantly throughout the game that we use to save to it. Then we have variable constant integer starting player lives and variable integer current player lives for later when we implement a game over ability. Um, and then finally we have variable global config integer save game choice, which allows this to pass on when we reload maps. It allows that allows us to hang in there so we know which game choice the person made. This really just holds the array number at this point, which is the purpose for it. So if save game choice is 0, then that means we're using the save game array 0 throughout the whole thing, and so on and so forth. It's used for helping load what puz save game is supposed to be. Down here in default properties real quick, we set puz save game info class to our class we just created called puzzlegame.puzsavegameinfo. And we set starting player lives to 3 because we're just going to give the player 3 lives throughout this whole puzzle, or all the puzzles basically. And if he runs out of lives, it's game over, and then that's going to allow us to create high scores later on. Okay, so back up to the top here. Like I said, we have post login. We go to setup game. Real quick though, because inside of our main menu function, we're going to start off by looking at what was getting called on. And on the new game button press, we do set new game. So let's just go look at that real quick. In set new game, we set save game choice to -1, and then we save config. Because it is a config, we need to save it so it carries over. The reason why we set this to -1 is because -1 represents a new game. 0 through 4 represents a save game. Or if you have more than 5 save games, it would obviously be more higher number than that. Okay, and then back at the main menu, we had another function that got called on, and that was on load game button pressed. We have I'm sorry, no, it was on set save game choice. We have set save game. So we're going to go back over to puz game here, and we're going to go to set save game. We pass that integer in. We've already subtracted 1 from it now, so now it equals the array. And it's if puz save game is not equal to none, so if that game does exist, we're going to do another check. We're going to set save game choice to equal that. We're going to save config so that carries through, and then we're going to set puz save game to that array. So now we can use puz save game as we work our way through the game. And then the last thing we do is we set load current map because we want to load the current map that was left off at. So we're going to go to load current map real quick, and we have local integer I, local string load map, and this is exactly like the other one where we load current map. It's just or we load the starting map in the main menu movie. We're going to basically do the exact same thing in this situation, except we're just going to find the current map name based off of the level number. Okay, so now let's go back up to setup game. Okay, so what's going to happen is whether it's main menu or any other map that we load, it's going to call on setup game first. So the player, even though he's looking at the main menu, setup game is also called as well. And the reason for this is because setup game actually creates our config file basically, and all of our saved games that exist inside of it. I guess it doesn't technically create the config file, but it reads from the config file. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down to setup game here, and the first thing it checks is it grabs the current map name, and if the map name is main menu, then it's going to do a check. It's going to say if map name is not equal to main menu, it's going to do all this stuff here, but we're going to hold off on this for just a second. If it's not equal to main menu, it's going to go down here, or if it is equal to main menu, I'm sorry, it's going to go down here to create saved config games. And what this function does is it creates the config games for us. And save game choice is set to -1. This is a temporary thing because we want to make sure that during the main menu phase that the the option is new game unless the player decides otherwise. So it doesn't, just because save game choice is set, it's not set in stone. It's just set temporarily until the player decides what to choose. Okay, so what is create saved config games? It is the function that creates our array of our saved games. So inside of here we do a local array string called config list, which is going to hold the instances of each saved game instance. Okay, and then we have a local integer I and local and namespaces. We're going to call in a function called getPerObjectConfig sections, and what this does is it grabs the section name, the title name in the config file that we're looking for. Well, we know the class is called PuzSavedGameInfo class, and then we're going to set that array. This is an out, so it's going to set it for us. We're passing it in, and it's going to set everything inside of it for us, called config list. So what's going to happen is it's going to grab every title of our save game list and for us to use. So I'm just going to jump in real quick inside of our config here, and I'm just going to show you what I'm talking about just so you get a better idea. As you can see, we have three saved games here. We have PuzSaveGameInfo underscore 0, underscore 1, and underscore 2. These are the instances of each of these saved games. Next to that is a space followed by PuzSaveGameInfo, which is equal to all of these because these are all PuzSaveGameInfo classes, so to speak, versions of the class. So, and then in here you can see the four things that were set. I did not type this in. This was created by the game for us. So, what the what that what the function does, what getPerObjectConfig sections does, is it basically grabs PuzSaveGameInfo underscore 0 space PuzSaveGameInfo, and then it grabs PuzSaveGameInfo underscore 1. It doesn't grab the stuff inside of it. It just grabs the title. That's all it grabs. All right. So now that we have that, we can go back up to our function here, and we're going to say if config_list.length is less than or equal to 0, return false. Because this is a bullet, it will let us know whether or not there is any saved games. And if there isn't anything in the length, if this array comes back empty from calling this function, we want to basically say, look, there's no saved games. There's no point in continuing. If, however, it's not, if there is an actual length to it, at least one, it's going to move down here, and we're going to do a for loop. Inside this for loop, we're going to set num spaces equals instr config list I, and then we're going to put a space. What instr does is it finds how many letters up until that space hits. Okay, so it's going to count for us, and we're going to set the number of spaces to what it counts, because what we're trying to do in this situation is we're trying to remove this. We're trying to remove PuzSaveGameInfo from this and just grab the name, because we don't need the class. It doesn't help us any. We know it's a PuzSaveGameInfo class. What we need is the number, what the instance value of this is. So that's the purpose of it. Okay, so it's going to grab the number of spaces. Then what we're going to do is we're going to set the config list I in the array to equal left config list I num spaces. Now what this is going to do is that it's going to then take those number of spaces, and it's just going to grab those letters from the left side over, left to right. It's going to grab that. So if for instance, if it's 7 letters, it's going to grab 7. So it would grab from here across. Whatever number of spaces it is, it's going to grab from left over. Okay, and then we're going to set config list I to that. So what's going to happen then is now we have an array of just the names of the config instances. So we have PuzSaveGameInfo underscore 0, 1, and 2. We no longer have this section here with the space over. Then what we do is we do an if check that says if I is less than max save games, because we only want to make sure we do this for the number of save games that we have. We're going to set PuzSaveGames I, so this is the version where we're keeping the array of 5, to equal a new PuzSaveGameInfo class. And then inside of our new operand, we're going to actually pass in config list I. We're going to pass in the in name of that value. So what we're going to do is, for instance, if it's array 0, it's going to hit here. It's going to say PuzSaveGame0 equals new config list 0 array PuzSaveGameInfo class. So it's going to basically set 0 to PuzSaveGameInfo underscore 0. So now What that means is because the names match, because that this is a PuzSave game, and it matches the name of the config list, we can now access this config list. We can now use these values by referring back to this save game in the array. And then obviously we return true. So this function basically reads the config list for us. Okay, so now that we have the ability to create our save games, we're going to go back up here to our setup game. So what happens is when we have our main menu load, it's going to find out what our save games is. That's what allows us to use this onload game button and actually access um, the information as well in our set save game button, or you know, to make sure the game exists as well. So that's the purpose of setup game. It's not just to set up the game. It's also to help the main menu understand what's going on as well. Those two things. Okay, so we're just going to run through real quick what happens if the player clicks the new game button, or how it works. Okay, so it starts off where the player loads loads the game, and when the game loads, eventually it's going to hit post login before the player even sees the main menu. Post login is going to call up on setup game. Setup game is going to then go. It's going to check here. It's going to say, oh, it is a main menu, so we're going to skip all this code. We're going to go down to else. We're going to create the save games config. We don't create, like I said, we don't create the actual config file. We read the config file in this case. We just create the save game config games, the array, and then we set save game choice to -1. Okay, so at that point the player says, oh, well, I just want to start a new game. So he clicks on new game, and what happens is he calls on set new game, which sets save game choice to -1, and then it saves the config. So basically it says to the game, we are going to start a new game. And it also loads the current map, because inside of here, the other function it did was it loads the current map. Now at that point, when it loads the current map, it's going to then load the map, but the player really won't see anything else at that point. It thinks, okay, well, I'm playing my game. But the code's not finished yet at that point, because now we're no longer in the main menu. So what happens is the game's going to reload, and when it reloads, it's going to hit post login again. When it hits post login again, it's going to hit setup game. So now we're going to go down to setup game again, and it's going to say, okay, now um, if the map name is not equal to main menu, well, this time it's not equal to main menu. This time the map name is equal to level 1, dungeon, whatever you want to call whatever your level 1 map is. So what's it going to do? First, it's going to say, it's going to create the save game configs again by calling the function, and it's going to check to see if it's true or false. If it's false, for instance, if there isn't a save game at this point, it's going to set save game choice to -1. This is kind of a fail-safe more than anything. So now we're going to go down. Okay, so really the person did click new game anyway, so it is set to -1. So we're going to do this. First, we're going to do a check here. We're going to say save game choice is greater than or equal to 0. Well, that's not true. It's -1. So if it was 0, that means we have a saved game, but it's not. So we're going to look at this later. So then we go down to else. Then it says PuzSaveGame equals new PuzSaveGame info class. So now what we've done is we're not reading from the config file because we don't need to. There is no save game option. We're just going to create a new PuzSaveGame info class at this point. We're going to set all the values to its starting value. So we're going to set player points to 0, current map level to number 1, player lives to starting player lives, which is 3, and then the save game ID num to equal 1. And then we're also, while we're at it, since we know it's a new game, we're going to set current player lives to equal starting player lives. But like I said, we haven't really fully implemented this yet, so this may change, but most likely this will stay there. And then after that, we're gonna do a for loop where we're gonna go look through all the saved games, if there is any, because in case the player did actually click on new game, but there is actually save game option, so he just wanted to start a new game for some reason. We're going to say if PuzSaveGames I is equal to none. So at the point when there is no saved games, we're going to set the save game ID number to that array plus 1. So the reason for this is that let's say there is 3, like for instance in our current config file here, we have 3 saved games. We have array 0, array 1, and array 2. So at this point, what we have is if we click new game, the ID num, if you notice, for game info underscore 2 is 3. Well, we know the next one is going to be 4 then. So, and 5 and so on and so forth. And that's the purpose of setting the ID num. We're just setting the next number in line. And then at that point, we're going to set save game choice to equal 0. And then we're going to save config. Now the reason for this is because the new game becomes the array 0 at this point. The way the config file works is your first game that you create, it reads from the bottom up. It doesn't read from the top down. So the first game you create, even though it might be game info underscore 0, and it will be array 0 at that point, when you create another new game, it actually, the array 0 will be taken over by pus save game info underscore 1. And then the pus save game info underscore 0 becomes array 1, or the second instance in the array, and so on and so forth. So it reads bottom up and not top down. The good side of this is it basically allows us to kind of, just through lucky magic, I guess, that if you constantly create save games, it's going to get rid of the oldest created save game. Not the oldest used save game, or, last time used save game, but the oldest created save game. So if you created 5 games, and then you create your 6th, it's going to get rid of the first save game you ever created. Or not really get rid of it, but it's going to make it not show up as an option to load, because we're only showing 5 saved games. That's one of the downsides to this, but we'll talk about that later. Okay, so at this point we set it to array 0 because that is going to be the new version of the save game that we'll be using. It'll be the new array if we actually do save this game later on. Okay, and that pretty much, then the player starts playing. And then if the player does, of course, get through the level and it hits level complete, then we're going to go down into our create save, or I'm sorry, into our save game ability here. Let me just scroll down here to level completed here. And inside of level completed, we have the save game information function that we call, and that basically saves our game information. So we scroll up here to save game information. If I can find it through all the code that we have now. Here it is. And we just say if pus save game is not equal to none, then we set pus save game to all the information, and then we save the config. And as soon as we do this, so if the player never completes level 1, it will not create a new moment in our config file. But if he does complete level 1, we save the config, and at this point it will create a new version inside of our config file. Okay, so that runs us through that. Now let's say the player decides to load a save game. All right, well, let's look at how that would work. So we start off once again. We hit Setup Game, and because it is not the main menu, we're going to quickly run through. It creates the save game, or it creates the array here for us to use. And we jump in the main menu here, and the player is going to click on the Load Game button. At that point, it's going to shoot through, and in this case, it's going to show 3 save game options. It's going to have Save Game 1, Save Game 2, and Save Game 3. And of course, it's actually going to be the pus save game info underscore 2 is actually going to be pus save game 1. Because, like as I mentioned, it starts from the bottom up. So this is save 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so at this point he sees that there is 3 save games, and he says, okay, I want to load a game. So he clicks on button 1. So what's going to happen is button 1's going to pass in. It's going to say param1 minus 1, so it's going to set 0. So we're going to look for array 0. And it's going to then set save game. So we're going to go over to pus game to set save game, and we're going to make sure it exists, which it does because it's right here. And we're going to set the save game choice to equal that save game. So now that 0 will exist, we save config, and now when the player loads the map, he will load that save game. And we set pus save game equals pus save games as well. So we set our instance this time. Instead of setting it to a new, we just set it to whatever it already exists, which is the pus save game games array. And then we load current map. As I mentioned, load current map pretty much is just like the other things. And then at that point, what happens is the map will load. We leave the main menu and the map loads. We hit setup game again. And once we hit setup game, we go down to it again here, and we once again we create our config games again. And this time though we have a 0. So we say if save game choice is greater than or equal to 0. So yes, it does equal 0. So we set pus save game again to equal pus save games 0. So now we set it to the array again. And the reason is because it doesn't carry over. When you reload the map, it does not carry over right now. We don't have any functionality set up to tell the system to carry over information. So we have to kind of reload it every time. Um, and then we do player points equals pus save game dot player points, and current player lives equals pus save game dot player lives left. And at that point, the player can actually start playing and completing levels and go on and so on and so forth. And that pretty much gets us to the end of this video. So if you if you notice that it pretty we at this point we are able to um, load the game, 5 games. Now let me talk about a few of the problems with this. Uh, the option's great. The feature's great right now because for a puzzle game, it's not really like we need any super high level save game feature. This isn't like an RPG or anything like that. However, the downside to it is, for instance, like I mentioned, is if we started to save game, save game, save game, save game, this saved game here will no longer exist on our list, so it kind of disappears. Even though the information still exists in the config file, it kind of just vanishes. There's a couple things you can do to do this. One is you can create a an option for the player to delete save games, and then maybe by doing that you set save game ID number to 0. And by setting it to 0, you're basically saying don't read this anymore. And then what you can do is instead of reading it through the array, when you're looking up your save games, you look it up through game ID number. And that would allow the save game ID numbers of zeros to not show up in your save game options. There's a lot of different ways you can go. So it all really depends on how you want your save game feature to work. Uh, but this leaves a lot of doorways open, so you can sprout out in different directions if you decided you want your save game feature to work a different way. It doesn't hard code it, so you have to figure out what you can remove to make it work right. And that pretty much completes this video.